Arrived and Dispatched. Written by Sean O'Keefe, copyright 2012. Read by the author. Who thought this would be a good place to put a flight school? Amanda Lash grimaced as she looked out the portal at the surface of Mars. For a world that was in the process of being terraformed, it had a long way to go. Never mind that the air pressure outside wasn't high enough for a bug to breathe. The sandstorms that often ripped the planet for years at a time still occurred from time to time, throwing the red dust into such a maelstrom that nothing could navigate through it. All the same, the red canyon they were perched on the edge of was breathtaking. They had nothing like it on her homeworld. Manny's eyes narrowed. Regardless of how pretty it was, the planet was still a dust bowl. How the humans thought anything could ever grow here, she could never begin to guess. She thought of her, as her man put it, boyfriend, Scanner, as she considered humanity. If there was one thing his people was capable of, it was optimism. After all, he had decided to court her, and the two of them were a study in contrasts. Whilst Judd Scanner, Sandage, was about as average as a human being could be, Amanda Lash was anything but for her people. The Kate were feline in form, highly intelligent, and generally leonine. The vast majority of her people's population was tawny in colour, much like the lions of the Serengeti. She, however, was white, a rarity to say the very least. In her society, she was a goddess, purely because she was born white. Most white Kate adored their position. Manny considered her condition a drawback. If she walked into any room on Kate, she would instantly become the centre of attention, much like Marilyn Monroe would have if she walked into a bar. Manny's whiskers bristled as she considered the notion. She was a male magnet on Kate, but the quality of Kate she tended to attract left a lot to be desired. Perhaps that was why she was so willing to look beyond her own species, a thought not only unheard of, but unthinkable, especially for a white Kate. Right then and there, she missed Scanner. His earth humour was growing on her, and he had a wonderful way of accepting her for who she was, not what she looked like. She sighed. However, orders were orders, and she was duty-bound to carry them out. Captain Piper had sent her to Mars on a special errand, and she was the last one to doubt her commander's wisdom. They had been through too much. Thinking of Piper brought her back to the present, and Lieutenant Amanda Lash of the USS Millennium turned and strode down the blue carpeted hallway away from the docking port. She had only just arrived on a shuttle from Vulcan, and she had decided she would check into her accommodation before running her little errand. "Come on, Ariel, you can do better than that." In times of stress or annoyance, Lieutenant Caitlin Ghost Ryan tended to lose the friendlier qualities of her native Irish accent. This time, it was annoyance, as Ghost's job was to help train a new batch of fighter pilot recruits for Starfleet. Indeed, the notion of having fighter pilots was something of the proverbial phoenix rising from the ashes, as there was not a lot of call for them, except for a home port defence, as fighters rarely sported warp drive. However, a new breed of starship had been created, the Ingram class, and the mammoth hangars the ships sported could house squadrons of fighters, not just a few shuttlecraft. So the call had gone out for people who not only didn't mind the danger involved in flying one- and two-man fighters, but who relished the challenge. All the same, drive wasn't enough. They had to have talent, and it was this trait Ghost was having the biggest problem with. In the 20th century, Miramar was known to naval aviators as the place where the best of the best trained and honed their skills. Since New Miramar had been created on Mars, they were starting to find that some of those old skills had been lost. New Miramar's mission was to recreate the elite. What they had were people Ghost wouldn't trust to fly a garbage scow. Like the person Ghost was berating right now. Ariel, if you don't pull your nose up, you're going to find yourself having a chance encounter with Deimos. If you don't get yourself killed, I'll send the bill for that fighter to your parents. Yes, Lieutenant, came the hurried reply. Ariel was young and impressionable, but she had the gumption to become a pilot, and that was good enough for Ghost. To Caitlin's delight, Ariel did as she was asked, and she cleared the moon by a good kilometre. All right, she said, doing her best to project confidence to her student. Give me an Immelman, followed by a split S, then come home. She didn't miss the hesitation as Ariel confirmed she understood the order. Cadet? Ghost asked. Understood, Lieutenant, Ariel reiterated before carrying out the order. Ghost let go of the tension in her body and relaxed once more into the black couch she used for teaching. She wore a headset connected directly to the cockpit of Ariel's fighter, and she had all the controls she needed under her fingers to take over the fighter at a moment's notice should the situation call for it. All she had to do was touch the override button. She watched on the domed ceiling overhead as Ariel performed the required maneuvers. Not flawlessly, but competently. Good, Cadet Pilot cited. Bring her home. Roger, Ariel responded before she locked her craft into New Miramar's locator beacon and programmed her ship to bring her home. At this point, Caitlin could have shut down her systems and simply let Ariel fly herself home. Yet she was not the kind to let fate rob her of another crewman. She had already been dealt enough bad hands by him in her lifetime, and she was not going to let him win another. Who would have thought you'd turn into a hovering mother? The voice seemed to come from nowhere, and Ghost turned her head to see who had spoken. At first she saw no one, and then suddenly a white feline head popped up on the left side of her chair and gave her a cheeky smile. She started at the suddenness, and then laughed when she recognized Lieutenant Amantlash of the Millennium, her crewmate. Caitlin gave her a mock growl and frown. And they call me Ghost, she said with a chuckle. What brings you here? There were some idioms that Manny had yet to learn. I caught the shuttle from Vulcan, she said matter-of-factly. Before Caitlin could question her further, she turned and looked up at the roof. This is amazing, Caitlin smirked. It is cool, she conceded before she pointed at the ceiling. But I'd rather be out there with them. Her friend understood. How's your back? Trying not to grimace, the flight trainer simply said, Not bad. Manny knew better. Her ability to read the thoughts and feelings of others was improving all the time. She rolled her eyes and said sympathetically, If I felt the way you do right now, I'd be reaching for a painkiller. Caitlin gave her a sideways look. I can't keep anything hidden from you these days, can I? Mildly embarrassed, Manny's tail started swishing from side to side. Sorry. If you were human, you'd be blushing right now. She considered the question for a moment, then confided, If I took a painkiller every time I'm in pain, I'd be a junkie in no time at all. Besides, I find they take the edge off my ability to think clearly, and if there's one thing I value, it's my ability to think clearly. Caitlin leaned forward slowly to get up. I use them as a last resort these days. She changed the subject to something a little less uncomfortable. So, like I said, what brings you here? Well, before she finished, something caused her to look up in alarm. Caitlin followed her gaze and immediately dropped back into the seat, Any further banter was forgotten as Ghost hit the override button and took control of Ariel's fighter, which was out of control and plunging to the surface so quickly that, if this was the Earth instead of Mars, she would have already burned up. "Don't worry, Ariel," she quietly announced into her headset. "I've got control." The screen changed to a forward view from Ariel's cockpit, and the relevant gauges lit up underneath. The first thing that became apparent was the ship was in a flat spin. The horizon bobbed up and down as the vessel spun anti-clockwise, the landmarks whizzing by around and around. To her left, Manny found the sight nauseating, even though she was stationary. She could not stand to look at it for longer than a few seconds. On the other hand, Ghost was completely calm as she applied right stick, cut back on the starboard engine, and applied full thrust with her port. Within seconds, the craft began slowing its spin, but not its drop. With only 3,000 feet to go, Ghost managed to stop the spin before she nosed the craft over, putting it into a dive, applied full throttle to both engines, and pulled the craft out of its dive at Mach 3. The shock of the sound barrier being broken rattled the windows even 5 kilometers away where Ghost was applying reverse thrust, giving the craft one vertical roll in the thin atmosphere to reduce her speed before bringing Ariel's craft into the pressurized landing bay to a sedate landing. "What the hell was that?" Manny heard someone yell anxiously down the hall. The base went on yellow alert as the command officers scrambled to find the source of the detonation. To her right, Ghost simply sat back with a sigh, her job done. "Give me a hand to get out of this thing, will you?" she asked as she swung her legs over the side of the couch. "I've got to let the brass know what's happened," she said with a grin. "I've always loved buzzing the tower." 5 minutes later, the two of them found themselves in the cavernous landing bay, standing next to Ariel's ship. Cadet Poseidon, a slender, 20-odd young woman with shoulder-length blonde hair and shining white teeth, remained with her fighter, red-faced and clearly anxious. Manny's nose wrinkled as she could detect the smell of vomit from the woman's uniform. No surprise to her that the nausea she had felt just watching the action would have been much worse for the cadet, as she was slammed against the side of the cockpit during the craft's spin. "What happened, Cadet?" Lieutenant Ryan, all business, asked, her arms crossed and in no mood for excuses. "I don't know," Poseidon said simply. "1 minute I was locked in on the beacon, the next my right thruster went into overdrive, and I was in a spin." Before Ryan could continue, they were joined by 4 other cadets. Each seemed genuinely concerned for Poseidon, and many marveled at the mix of cultures. There was a Tellarite female, an Andorian male, a Zindi primate male, and of all things, an Orion male. Starfleet seemed to be taking people from all species and walks of life these days, she thought. Each one voiced their concerns for Ariel's health. "Are you all right?" being the most oft-asked question. Ryan silenced them all with a look. "She's alive," she said. "That's what counts. What's important is what we've learned from today's mishap." At that, Ariel put up her finger. She was beginning to get her nerve back. "Lieutenant, it wasn't my fault. My hands were nowhere near the throttle controls when the thruster fired." Her teacher's first reaction was doubt. "Thrusters don't just fire by themselves, Cadet," she snapped. As the words were coming out of her mouth, she remembered she was herself a victim of a malfunction that had grounded her. It was possible. She felt a tap on her back and realized Lieutenant de Mandelash had been trying to get her attention surreptitiously. She glanced at her and saw all she needed to. Manny's eyes were telling her the cadet was being truthful. She gave her a faint nod and turned back to the cadet. "Perhaps we should get your fighter checked out." As Ariel sighed with relief, Caitlin turned and beckoned to the chief of the deck, who began sauntering over. All the while, Amantalash was bothered. As she had opened herself to Ariel's thoughts and emotions, she had felt something else nearby. She couldn't put a name to it at first, until she realized what it was she was picking up. Deceit. Upon the mention of the fighter being examined, the feeling changed to panic. Something was definitely wrong here. She decided to take a chance and flush out the individual responsible. "Lieutenant Ryan," she said loudly enough for all to hear. "I never got a chance to tell you while I'm here. Captain Piper got a word from that the Duras family has put out a bounty on any Millennium crew members as payback for their loss of face at the London Corps. She wanted you to know that you might be a target as well." Caitlin turned to her in surprise, her eyes wide open. She had plenty of enemies already as a successful fighter pilot with more victories than most. "Now that's a compliment if I've ever heard one," she said with a smile. Now the emotions were broadcasting themselves loud and clear. The fear of being discovered was practically overwhelming, and the sender was now easily identifiable to Amantalash. Both she and Caitlin instinctively looked at the Orion, Cadet Seelan. "Do you have something to add?" Caitlin asked, suddenly very much aware that she was not carrying a weapon. Seelan narrowed his eyes, revealing the cruel personality underneath the thin shell he had created. "So you found me," he said, with not a trace of remorse. His cover blown, he now had no need for subterfuge. His hand went for his jacket pocket, but Amantalash beat him to it, knocking the mini phaser out of his hand with her tail as he withdrew it. Thinking quickly, he stepped to the side and grabbed the Tellarite female around the throat. "Try anything and I'll snap her neck like a twig." Before she could recover, Seelan began dragging her backwards towards his fighter, with Caitlin, Manny, and the rest of the cadets following. "I said get back!" he snarled once more. By this stage, the Tellarite prisoner had had enough fun. There was no way this skinny Orion was ever going to break her thick neck. She drove her elbow into his ribs and sent him flying backwards. Unfortunately, he fell into the open cockpit of his practice fighter, and before they could stop him, he toggled the cover closed. "Get back!" Caitlin called, as she saw him begin to rapidly flick switches, bringing the vessel's small engines online. "Is there any way we can stop him?" Manny yelled as the craft's engines began to roar. Ryan shook her head. "No! The only thing we should be doing is run!" At that, she turned and ran, looking for cover, her suspicions confirmed as she heard the fighters' weapons begin to charge. The cadets scattered in all directions, each one looking for an exit. Manny, however, realized the Seelan was still going to try to fulfill his mission. She pushed Caitlin behind a large metal crate on the floor where, out of sight of the fighter, she hit the secret panel only engineers knew to look for. The scanner had shown her, and opened a maintenance hatch in the floor. Together they dropped down into the cavity, the hatch closing over them as the crate exploded over their heads. On the floor, Caitlin squirmed in agony. The fall had practically paralyzed her with pain, as her injury had been abused. A part of her brain registered she should be happy to be still alive, but right now it wasn't winning the argument. Concerned, Manny reached out to help her in the dim light from the machinery next to them. Caitlin reached up and battered her paw away. No, I need to sit still for a moment." The security officer understood. If Seelan's fear earlier had been calling out to her as if from a distance, next to her, Caitlin's mind was virtually screaming in pain. She sat back on her haunches and tuned her ears to listen as Seelan wreaked destruction on the landing bay overhead. She could only surmise that he was destroying the rest of the fighters to prevent them from following. As she waited, she noticed that Caitlin reached down and take a small hypo spray from a pocket in her slacks. Without preamble, she injected herself in the neck and tried to relax as the painkiller went to work. She gave Manny an embarrassed look. "Last resort time," she muttered. Amantalash simply nodded. She sympathized. She was finding it hard to block her friend's pain out, even though it was quickly subsiding. Instead, she turned her attention to the deck above and listened. Within moments, the sound of destruction ended, followed by the roar of an engine as Sealand blasted out of the landing bay at high speed. Caitlin rolled over and grabbed Manny's arm. "Open the hatch," she said. "I've got to go after that bastard." "Are you sure you're up to it?" The security officer's duty warred with a concern for her friend. "No, but like hell I'm just going to let him go scot-free." She rolled her painfully onto her knees, and besides, he's stolen a Federation fighter, and that's enough reason for me. "Good point," Manny said with a slight smile. She reached up and touched the lock, opening the hatch to a scene of utter chaos. Whilst the fire suppression systems had already put out the majority of the flames, pockets of destruction were still burning. Manny immediately started coughing, as did Caitlin, even though she had pulled her sleeve over her mouth. Around them, there was nothing left to fly. Every craft in the bay had been totaled. Manny wanted to ask Caitlin what she was planning on going after him in, but couldn't over her own continuous coughing. Overhead she could hear the computer announcement, "Please leave the area." "Duh," Caitlin said between gasps. She towed Manny over to a side blast door and hit the release. The door shot up to reveal the sleek, matte black form of Caitlin's private fighter, the Spectre. With its aerofoil wings, torpedoes, phasers, and enormous engines, it seemed more like a futuristic hot rod than a ship of war. Even the paint seemed to absorb the light that touched it, making it appear like a flying black hole. "Come on!" Both females stepped into the twin seats of the craft, Caitlin taking the front. They donned their helmets. Manny hated hers as it flattened out her ears, and strapped themselves in. Without asking for clearance, Caitlin fired up the engines, raised the craft off the floor, then gunned her engines. Amantalash watched the fires pass by in a dizzy blur, quickly replaced by a red one as the martial landscape whizzed by. Day quickly became night as the fighter passed through the planet's thin atmosphere and out into space. "Keep your eyes forward," Ghost suggested. "It'll keep you from bringing up your lunch." Manny grimaced. She was already beginning to feel nauseous. "Thanks for that." "All business?" Ghost asked. "Check the scanners. Find him for me." Amantalash's training kicked in and she keyed in the query. "He's headed for the asteroid belt." Ghost nodded to herself, gently so she wouldn't exacerbate her back injury. "That's exactly where I'd hide a ship if I were a bounty hunter." Manny understood the implied statement. The fighter was restricted to satellite speeds. To effect an escape, Sealand would need a warp-capable vessel. "I'm right about him, aren't I?" Caitlin added, curious. At that, Manny rolled her eyes. She found it incongruous that the people who were so often uneasy about her abilities could so readily call upon them. She had noticed some people would actually shy away from her for fear of having their mind read. Then, truth be told, the most she got from the majority of people was the odd impression. Their thoughts could usually only be heard as nothing more than background noise. For Ghost's sake, she simply said, "Yes." The pilot shifted in her seat, suddenly uncomfortable, and it wasn't about her spine. "I'm going to push the Spectre to the limits to get this bloke, Lieutenant, because I've got about 5 minutes before the drug takes full effect and knocks me out." What? Manny was stunned. Matter-of-factly, Caitlin stated, you'll have to fly us home when I pass out. Great. Amanda Lash remembered back to her Starfleet training, which included a basic flying class that was known amongst the cadets as the Beginner's Guide to Not Crashing. Please tell me this thing has a big red button labelled Fly Home. Ghost gave a little laugh. Nothing so simple, I'm sorry. What you can do is simply fly us back to Mars, and the base will tractor the Spectre home. That, at least, gave her friend a little hope. Whatever happened, Amanda Lash was a warrior, and pragmatic. The job had to be done, and there were no other choices. Let's do it. With that said, Caitlin pushed the fighter to its limits. The increased G-forces pushed them back in their seats, as the inertial dampeners could not quite keep up with Ghost's demands. As Ghost moaned, Manny watched their scanners. You know, if we go any faster, we're going to have time dilation problems. Caitlin shrugged. Better we catch him before he gets to the asteroids, don't you think? Manny shivered. She had little confidence when it came to navigating through them. Agreed. A moment later she announced, He's nearly in firing range. We have him. I don't think so. Ghost wasn't so certain. If we can see him, he can see us. As soon as the computers registered a target lock, Seelan entered the outer edge of the asteroid field. To break the lock, he swung around a huge rock and brought his faces to bear on the Spectre. Before he could squeeze off a shot, he swung away blindly, doing his best to avoid the photon torpedo Ghost had launched at the asteroid. Seelan's fighter was jostled as the oversized boulder disintegrated behind him, showering his shields with debris, dropping them 50%. You missed! Seelan hissed over subspace as he sought refuge among the asteroids. A little more chipper, Ghost replied. Actually, I didn't. More deadly, she added. You're next. She switched to internal comms and said, Manny, look for his ship. We could get lost in this mess, but he has to take us to it sooner or later. Amanda Lash nodded and set to work as Ghost pushed her fighter, dodging floating rock after rock in her mad chase to hunt Seelan down. After a few moments, she began to realize she was starting to lose her reflexes. The drug was taking effect. Got it, Manny said victoriously. I'm feeding you the coordinates now. Ghost looked down and saw it and formed a plan. She fired at an asteroid Seelan was passing. For all the bounty hunter's poor flying back at the base, she found he was actually quite good, blasting it into dust and obscuring both the craft's sensors momentarily. When Seelan looked behind him, he found he was alone. Suspicious, he took a circuitous but quick route back to his ship to find a black shadow falling over it in the shape of the Spectre. Hello, Seelan, Ghost said almost cheerfully. Say goodbye to your ship. Before he could utter a word, Ghost fired her remaining photon torpedo into the engines of the modest-sized interstellar ship. It exploded spectacularly, leaving the bounty hunter with no escape. Now, Seelan, Ghost said quietly, you can either be escorted back to Mars by us, or take your chances trying to fly to Proxima Centauri. It'll take you about 4 years to get there. I hope you packed a cut lunch. Caitlin's mirth was entirely lost on the Orion. The only thing he saw right then and there was red. The human pilot had destroyed not only his escape plan, but his favourite ship as well. To top it off, there was no way he was going to spend the rest of his life in a Federation penal colony. He wasn't going to let his wife spend all the hard-earned currency he had spent his life building while he rotted away in a place where money had no significance. His finger tightened on the firing button. In the Spectre, things were not going too smoothly. The drug was coming into full effect, and all Ghost had a chance to say was, "Manny, take over," before her head lolled back, and she passed out. Amanda Lash had two choices: panic and get killed, or try to remember as much as she could and use it. She took option 2. She quickly found the button to transfer control to her seat, then reached out with her mind to scan her enemy. In the emptiness of space, and with Caitlin out cold, the only mind that registered was Sealand's. She immediately realized he was out for blood. Taking the stick in her right paw, she pushed the phaser trigger and sent 2 bolts towards Sealand's fighter. They just missed. However, they did have the positive effect of rattling Sealand. Instead of shooting back, he ran. Manny throttled up and began to give chase, firing again. Her confidence grew with each shot as her aim began improving. A glancing blow destroyed Sealand's sensor pod, and suddenly he found himself flying blind with only the light from the distant sun to reveal the asteroids. He felt confident he could avoid them and still evade the Spectre. He was wrong. He ran into a rock that was made mostly of carbon and iron that had all the reflectivity of a dead sun. It smashed straight into the cockpit bubble, venting Sealand's air into space and instantly freezing him as he wasn't wearing a spacesuit. The fighter began spinning and fell straight towards the minor planet Vesta, which was anything but forgiving to a tumbling spacecraft. The tiny craft shattered on impact. A smile played over Amanda Lash's lips at the thought the killer was dead, but it departed when she realized that the real culprit was still well and truly alive. Duras. He would have his day, she thought coldly. The Klingon had messed with her life twice already. She had no intention of letting him have a third try. Her job done, she watched the scanner with a keen eye and turned the Spectre for home. She kept the fighter at 1/4 impulse and managed to miss every asteroid in the belt until she cleared it. Once free, she had some fun and found out what the custom-made fighter could do. Caitlin Ryan woke up in a sick bay bed, wondering for a moment how she got there. Her head was still buzzing from the medication, and she quickly realized her back was numb. She panicked as the notion came to her that she had been paralyzed and would never fly again. A fluffy hand caught hers as she gripped the sheets in terror. "You're all right," Amanda Lash said gently. She had been waiting for hours for the lieutenant to wake up. "The doctors numbed your back for you for a while to give you some relief. It's temporary." The words came as a ray of sunlight to a darkened ghost. She forced a tight smile and said, "Thanks." Suddenly the day came back to her. "What happened after Manny purred in jest. "Passed out?" she finished with a grin. "Sealand put a new crater in Vesta," she said. "Then I flew us home." Caitlin's eyes widened in surprise. She had no idea the security officer had any flying skills. "I'm impressed," she said honestly. "When I'm out of here, I'll give you some lessons." Manny's whiskers bristled in delight at the notion. "I'll take you up on that." Some of the humour left her friend. "I'm afraid the doctor said you will be with them for a little while, and you'll need some more rehab before you return to the Millennium." The pilot didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The last thing she wanted was some more physiotherapy. In her opinion, its practitioners were all sadists. Her friend had also revealed that she would soon be returning to her primary role as fighter coordinator on the fleet flagship. It was a career builder, that was certain, but it would once again rob her of opportunities to fly. She let out most of her feelings with a heartfelt sigh. At least I can look forward to exploring space again with the rest of the family. Mantelash nodded. There were a few more things she needed to share. While you're still here, a security guard will be posted to watch over you. Duras will probably try again. Ryan shot her an angry look. I don't need a babysitter. Manny returned the look with one of her own. Don't be foolish, Caitlin. If I hadn't been there, you would have been toast, as you humans put it. Her remark hit the mark, but her feelings were still singed. Caitlin let the heat leave her eyes, then said, Where is my babysitter, then? She looked towards the door and saw no one. Her friend put up her paw. I am, until my shuttle leaves in an hour. Captain Piper needs me back, ASAP. I hear we may be going to my homeworld. The comment stirred a memory. Caitlin looked up and caught Manny's eye. Tell the captain this. I know what happened to the Ingram, and I suggest she look into Drishtagoth. Manny was startled. Only a handful of people were read into the file, and as far as she knew, Caitlin wasn't one of them. Instead of questioning her about it, she simply nodded. The mention of a name from Kate, her home, was disturbing. The idea that her people could be involved was appalling. She changed the subject as she thought of returning to her home in the stars, the USS Millennium. You know, I heard a rumor that you may get your bars back for what you did today, Commander. Ryan laughed and shook her head. She realized the promotion back to her old job didn't interest her as much as being in the company of good friends. She also realized that she, too, was looking forward to returning to their ship. The end.